I'm your host and social cultural expert, Kaylee Wise. Today is January 1st, 1865, and on the special edition, we're doing an 1864 year in review. First, let's hand it over to our military expert, Julia Rayburn.
I'll be discussing some of the most important battles from throughout the year. First is the Battle of Fort Pillow on April 12th. This was one of the most controversial events of the American Civil War. Over 300 African American soldiers were killed, and the Union soldiers who surrendered were also killed by Confederate soldiers, but should have been taken as prisoners of war. This action led to the Union's refusal to participate in prisoner exchanges. Fort Pillow was first constructed by the Confederacy in 1861 and was named after General Gideon Johnson Pillow, and was a base for the North after the Federal Army forced the Confederate soldiers to retreat in 1862. In March of 1864, Confederate Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest launched a cavalry raid in western Tennessee and Kentucky, destroying Union supplies and capturing Federal prisoners. General Forrest then moved to Fort Pillow, and on April 12th, Forrest and his troops quickly overran the base. The Union soldiers began to retreat to a small bluff, calling a truce, where they were taken as prisoners and, as previously mentioned, killed. Next, we have the Valley campaigns of 1864 at Shenandoah Valley. Shenandoah Valley was very important to the Confederacy. It was the main storehouse for feeding the armies, but it was hard to maintain and caused a lot of problems for the South. So Ulysses S. Grant put into motion the 1864 Shenandoah Valley campaign that put Major General Philip Sheridan in command. Within 2 months, he had delivered a series of defeats, hurting the Confederates' control of the land, and covered the valley in ashes, forever ruining it and its ability to sustain Federal forces. This was a major loss for the South and caused a lot of problems throughout the war. Next, we have the Battle of Cold Harbor from June 1st to 3rd. East of Richmond at Cold Harbor, Grant made his costliest decision during a campaign that was already considered to be an ongoing funeral procession. The battle climaxed on the third day, and an assault on the Confederacy that killed 7,000 Union soldiers, and from both sides this was deemed Grant's slaughter pen. It was later described by a survivor as murder and not war. After a month, Grant had lost more men than Lee had in his entire army. Many Southerners were left starving and in devastating conditions. Lastly, I'd like to discuss the March to the Sea. From November to December, General William Sherman, while in Atlanta, decided to wage war on the South, destroying their armies and economy, and their will. Sherman and his armies marched 300 miles across Georgia to the coast of Savannah, waging war against not only soldiers but civilians too. Sherman's men destroyed food, crop, and supplies supporting Confederacy, as well as show the Southerners that, as Sherman said, if the North can march an army through the South, it is proof positive that the North will prevail. Sherman had to consider Hood's Confederate army, and so he sent 30,000 men under General George Thomas to Nashville to watch Hood while Sherman marched. While he began his march, Hood began an invasion of Tennessee, but Thomas stood firm and repulsed Hood's attacks. This became known as the Battle of Nashville. Sherman's march continued, leaving a 50 to 60 mile wide path of destruction from Atlanta all the way to Savannah. Upon reaching Savannah, Sherman estimated that he'd done around $100 million worth of damage, leaving the South in ruins. These were some of the most important battles throughout 1864.
Julia, thank you for recapping the domestic affairs of the year. Next, let's pass it on to Elizabeth Crady, the biographic critic and political analysis.
So today I'm going to be talking about 3 major people in the year of 1864. The election of 1864 was between Abraham Lincoln and George B. McClellan. Abraham Lincoln was a self-taught lawyer, legislator, and vocal opponent of slavery. Lincoln proved to be a shrewd military strategist and a savvy leader. He was the 16th President of the United States of America. He became president in 1860 and ran for re-election in 1864. He won the election during the Civil War, but it was a close call. The Civil War promised Abraham Lincoln the end of slavery. Lincoln was assassinated shortly after the war. Knowing this, I would rate Lincoln 4 stars. The next person I will be talking about is his opponent, George B. McClellan. He is often remembered as the great organizer of the Union Army. His military command style, however, put him at odds with President Abraham Lincoln and would ultimately upset his military and political fortunes. In 1864, McClellan became involved in politics when he was nominated to be the Democratic candidate for the president against his former boss, Abraham Lincoln. McClellan ran on an anti-war platform, promising that he would negotiate peace terms with the Confederacy to help end the war as soon as possible. But by November of 1864, a string of Union successes had convinced many that the war was in its final phase. McClellan resigned his Army commission on Election Day, but ultimately Lincoln was elected to a second term. I would give McClellan 3 stars. The last person I'm going to be talking about is Ulysses S. Grant. Grant began his military career as a cadet at the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1839. After a series of decisive yet costly battles and victories at Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga, Grant was promoted to lieutenant general by President Lincoln in 1864 and given charge of all the Union armies. President Abraham Lincoln signed a brief document officially promoting then Major General Ulysses S. Grant to the rank of Lieutenant General of the U.S. Army, tasking the future president with the job of leading all Union troops against the Confederate Army. Knowing this, I would give Grant 4 stars.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for expanding on the leaders of 1864. Continuing on that note, I will be discussing the role of the media in the election of 1864. In the election, Abraham Lincoln ran against George B. McClellan. During this, the media's presence was very strong, and campaigning became super important during this time, especially since technology is quickly growing. An example of this is Lincoln's campaign poster. The newspapers and journalism grew rapidly with the help of rumor spreading. Confederate newspapers in Virginia during the Civil War served as crucial sources of reporting on the conflict. They mostly used propaganda or as an attack to defend the Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Newspapers gained the ability to mass produce and spread quickly throughout the North and South due to railroads and trains. The journalists who covered the Civil War depended on telegraphs, railroads, and horses. Another important invention included the telegraph, which was invented in the 1830s by Samuel Morse. This influenced the media in the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln and the Union Army War Department set up their own telegraph office to communicate. And Abraham Lincoln recognized that the press played a role in public opinion, and he used the press effectively. But he wasn't afraid to shut down the newspapers. Many of these telegrams were written in code to keep the Confederate Army from intercepting and reading messages. Now, for the first time, the telegrams are being transcribed and are available for public use. Photography is also new and uprising. This invention allows people at home to see what is going on in the war. Matthew Brady and Alexander Gardner are 2 very popular photographers of the Civil War. And this recaps the election of 1864. Lastly, we will be hearing from Campbell Lemon, our economic advisor.
The economy continued to suffer during 1864 as Union armies battled Confederate troops in the Eastern and Western territories. By 1860, 90% of the nation's manufacturing output came from northern states. Free states attached the vast majority of the waves of European immigration. The economy continued to suffer during 1864 as Union armies battled Confederate troops in the Eastern and Western territories. By 1860, 90% of the nation's manufacturing output came from northern states. Free states attracted a vast majority of waves of European immigration through the mid-19th century. In 1860, the economic value of slaves in the United States exceeded the invested value of all the nation's railroads, factories, and banks combined. In the East, General Ulysses S. Grant, through men and material, Robert E. Lee's depleted and increasingly desperate army. Grant took advantage of railroad lines and new improved steamships to move his soldiers and his seemingly endless supplies of troops supplies, weapons, and materials to dedicate to crushing Lee's often ill-fed and undermanned army. In the western area of the war, William T. Sherman's Union troops laid waste to much of Georgia's countryside during the Atlanta campaign and the following event, the March to the Sea. Sherman's campaigns inflicted massive damage to the Southern industry, agriculture, and infrastructure. His soldiers destroyed rail lines and captured the major economic and transportation hub of Atlanta and the critical seaport of Savannah. Sherman himself later estimated that his campaign would eventually move north and similarly impact the Carolinas, causing $100 million of destruction. An already troubled Confederate economy simply could not absorb such massive losses and survive. For better or worse, the political philosophies underlying the creation of the Confederate States of America, with its emphasis upon the strong states and a weak central government, coupled with its vast investments in a slave labor-based agricultural economy, meant that the South had neither the ability nor the desire to develop the kind of industrial economy or centralized financial system required to sustain a modern war. By contrast, the Union's willingness and availability to vastly increase the influence and footprints of the federal government not only contributed directly to the military success of the war, but it also transformed many other areas of national life, including industrial, economic, agriculture, mechanical, and financial areas.
Thank you so much for tuning in. This concludes the Affairs of 1864.